thank you for joining me today for our shared inquiry session. I hope that you learned something and I hope this really benefits your students. So, shared inquiry is really interesting in that it supports our Common Core state standards and the learning strands, especially for literacy. So, I know that everyone is through the new 2020 initiative. I know that everyone is getting a refresher on those strands and how they can support the strands through their content area. So even before I knew that was part of the 2020 initiative, I had already planned to do this. So that to me is like super awesome. And I hope that this is one way that you feel like, oh, kind of like a relief because this supports what they're asking you to do. So this is just one way that, hey, you can use this now. So really neat. All right, so what is shared inquiry? That's why you're here. Well, in a nutshell, it's a discussion strategy. So it's definitely different than a Socratic seminar, which many of you are familiar with. And if you're not, feel free, we can talk about that. I love Socratic seminar. And it's different than a Paideia, but there are some similar characteristics. So if you've done a discussion strategy before, you know that students absolutely love them, okay? And this is a little bit different, okay? So here, participants are actually reading a text, which I'm sure with your other discussions that you've used in your classes, they're actively reading. But this kind of breaks it down to the point where, you know, without a doubt, you're supporting literacy. And to me, it makes it easier. Okay, so the only hard part for you is finding a text, and then doing the legwork behind it. So basically participants are actively reading, like I said, and they're answering questions raised by the text. And in the discussion, they are using textual evidence, okay, to support their reasoning. So shared inquiry was created by two educators, and some of you may be familiar with them, especially my folks in the AIG corner, Robert Hutchins and Mortimer Adler. They had this idea. They wanted to support literacy, and they wanted to support students in general, but specifically, they wanted to expand opportunities for people, mostly students, to read and talk about text. So they created the Great Books Foundation back in 1947, and as the years progressed, they realized they wanted a discussion strategy to make students really get that close read and really, you know, interact with that text. So they created shared inquiry. Ding, 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 ding. So this is not my idea. This is not something I came up with. There are some parts of this where I've kind of adapted or made it to where, like I said, it's a little bit easier to do. And I did that in collaboration with some other teachers that I've worked with. So shared inquiry does require planning, and it requires work. But in our field, we always plan and we always work. So nothing new there. It's super duper rewarding as long as you come prepared. And I say that because it's really important to know that students must come prepared for the discussion. Like you can't just show up on day one, you know, on day two of the process and not be ready, because it's not going to work. So that to me made me a little nervous at first when I first learned about the strategy, but I can try to give you some tips and tricks and strategies to help you make sure that your students are successful. So I mean, that's kind of, but it's kind of intuitive because the learner agency is all about coming prepared. So it's what we want our students to be able to do anyway. But it's, you know, we always have those students who have a struggle at home or have something that may prohibit them from coming to school with their homework or an assignment being complete. So, and sometimes, you know, we just forget. So, and students forget things too. So, you know, we can talk about some ways to remedy that. Okay. So also just kind of like a little heads up, the first discussion could feel awkward to you, especially if you are not used to it being, and if you're more like a teacher-directed lessons and teacher-directed classroom, then shared inquiry might feel awkward, and it might feel like you're not doing anything the first couple of times. So you have to relinquish control. This is student-led. Mostly, and I kind of say mostly because the first couple shared inquiries that you do, you know, I would encourage you to be the leader. and then eventually to start giving some of that control to the students. But, hey, if this, the first, couple months, maybe the students you have currently this school year, you might not put a student in charge quite yet. You're still getting the process down. So, it takes time, and it's also up to you. I mean, you don't have to, but even if you don't, even if you still are the leader, the students are leading the discussion essentially. So in itself, it's student-led, but it can be truly, completely student-led if you want it to be. And I'll explain how in just a moment. So why shared inquiry? Well, there are many, 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 many reasons, but it truly fosters a relationship between the reader and the writer, because as a reader, you want students to be active readers, active participants of the text. And an active participant in a text is asking questions as they read. That's what good readers do. So shared inquiry truly encourages that. And it can be any question. So, as you're reading, I'm sure things pop in your head without you even thinking about it. So it's the same thing. And now you're just writing it down. As well as for fostering this relationship, it encourages critical thinking. And that's one of, our buzzwords. That's one of our 4 C's. So it makes a student read a text closely. And as a teacher, you can't just assign a text without reading it, which I know you guys already know that, but it's going to make you read a little bit deeper too. So there's multiple reads, and the different types of reads, you're reading for detail, you're reading for, meaning, you're reading for creating and formulating your arguments. And as you're reading, you're creating probing questions, you're annotating, you're taking notes, you're using textual evidence. So all over the place, you are supporting the Common Core State Standards literacy shift. So ding, 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 that's one of the good reasons why. All right, another reason is, so 21st century learning is all about students taking the lead. So student-centered classrooms, okay? The students are discussing what they think is important, why they think it's important. They're telling me things that they think is interesting. It's all about creativity. It's leading, students are going down this path almost about this text, and they're constantly, your job is to make sure that they are focused on the text. So whatever idea that they have or they share or question that they pose, you're making sure they're referring it back to the text. So together, the group is exploring meaning together. So that's collaboration. And once again, it's fostering learner agency, because students are taking control of their learning and what they're learning and what they're discussing, essentially. So once again, it builds 21st century skills, because students are arguing, they're responding appropriately, they learn how to do that, they learn how to wait, how to take turns, they work together, and ding, 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 active listening. I mean, middle school students and active listening is, you've taught, that's something they really need to work on. So this helps support that. So we've definitely got the 4 C's here, and that's just to name a few. I could keep going. All right, overview. So basically, there's this focus, obviously, on interpretation and discussion of literature, and it's kind of broken down. So these are pretty much the 5 steps. It's a 2-day process. Okay, so on the first day, you're going to introduce the story. And I say 2 readings of the story. It's actually more than 2, but I say 2 because the first is teacher-led, because you want, and I'll kind of get into why in a minute, but just to be short and brief, teacher-led the first read. Second read is the student, and then actually it's going to be more than, that second read, because they're going to read multiple times. And then the next step is question and note-taking activities. And the first 3 things the first 3 things on this list are all on the first day. And some of the note-taking activities in the support sheet, in parentheses here I have shared inquiry support sheet. I'm going to be providing you with the support sheet. And the support sheet is something that, this is one of the things that I collaborated with some other teachers. And this is just a resource that makes a shared inquiry much easier on you and your students. Feel free to adapt that, and feel free to make it work for you. And if you make adaptations, I would love to see what you're doing, because I'm always up for ideas. Okay, so, and then on the second day is when you actually hold your discussion. And earlier when I mentioned that students must come prepared, they have to participate in that first read. They have to participate in that, they need to do their own reading on their own, and then they need to do those question and note-taking activities in order to participate in the discussion, because otherwise it just won't work. And then lastly, writing activities. So writing activities can either go on the second day, or if you want to extend it, it can go to the third day, or it could be like a homework activity. And that's usually a reflective piece. So sometimes, as a teacher, you have control over how long that reflective activity is, or it may lead you into, a unit of learning that you're using. So you can kind of make that what you want. All right, so just to kind of refresh your memory, we know good reading instruction includes before reading, during reading, and after reading activity. So just to kind of, hit on how does this hit all these pieces? Well, in the beginning, they're going to be connecting to the story, they're going to be building background knowledge, and this is where you're going to introduce important vocabulary. So hold the phone. Why do we need to do before reading strategies? Well, your students, even if they, especially your students that struggle, but truly all students, when you're reading a text, especially one that you're going to do with a shared inquiry, you want to pick a text that is difficult. And I'm not saying so difficult that they're going to be in tears, but it needs to be rigorous. It needs to be something definitely either above or on their reading level, grade level. Why? Because that's what it calls for. That's what our standards are asking us to do. And as teachers, we need to support literacy in all aspects. So connecting to the story and building background knowledge is going to help all of our readers, but especially those that struggle. It gives them a good starting point so they can start making connections in their head. And then vocabulary, for obvious reasons, especially if you're reading a text that is on grade level or right above grade level, there may be some words in there, especially some tier 2 and 3 words that could pose an issue for students, okay? Or, so anyway, during reading strategy, that's going to be when you're modeling that first read. And so for our students that struggle with reading, this is going to help them tremendously because you're going to read with appropriate expressions, and this levels the playing field. So I know you're probably sitting there thinking, okay, so I've been told to level text, but what now? So really, the new Common Core calls for us or asks us to make text accessible, and that's a little bit different. So we just need to level the playing field so that it's fair for all students. And the second read is on their own with a support sheet. So that support sheet, when we go over it, will make a little bit more sense to you, but it's supporting the reading process. It's supporting the discussion that's going to happen the next day. And it's also providing support for all types of students. And, if you have that student or students in your class that struggle or having a really hard time, it's perfectly acceptable for you to sit with them or sit with a small group and read it that second time with them. So don't feel like that would be a bad thing. Or, even partnering a student up with someone if you can't necessarily, if you're working with another student and you need that extra hand in there, you can partner that student up with someone who, maybe they're reading individually, but if they come to something that they don't understand or they don't know a word, they can ask that student too for a little more support. All right, and text, and so some of the reasons that we do this is because texts are complex. We want them to become familiar with it because that's going to help them formulate critical thinking. And a good way to help them also during reading is to annotate. And you can annotate a couple different ways. I know a lot of times we print paper, we copy paper and on paper, and they write on the paper. Well, what do you do when it's a magazine or it's a textbook or it's something that, you only have a class set of? Well, there's two things you can do. You can use Post-its, and you can take pictures. And what do you mean take pictures? Well, you can take a picture and the students can use their device, BYOD, okay? They can bring it and they can annotate the text using a photo editor, okay? A photo editor. Yeah, they all have them on their phones because, they love selfies and all that jazz. So, yeah, they can take a picture of it. Or you can take pictures beforehand and give it to them. So that's a little neat way to include technology. All right, so now we're getting to before, during, after reading. So what is this after reading strategy? Well, there's a support sheet and the shared inquiry discussion. So anyway, all right. So conducting a shared inquiry. What is or what does a shared inquiry look like? I would suggest arrange a seating area in a circle. Why? Because the leader and students can see one another. And if you can see one another, then you'll be able to listen to and talk directly to one another. So that's a really important aspect. It also encourages genuine interaction and stimulates a discussion when you can actually see that person, when you are looking at them and you're all looking at one another. And as the leader of the discussion, or eventually if you relinquish your control and you give, you make some students the leader or the facilitator, really, I guess I should say facilitator. The teacher or the facilitator needs to be part of the discussion. You need to sit at eye level with the student. So I always pull up a chair, a student desk, and I sit right there with them. It shows them that you are on the same playing field. It shows them respect. It gives them a feeling of empowerment, because sometimes you have students who don't necessarily want to talk out in front of everyone, like they want to kind of stay behind the scenes. And this shows them that you trust them, that you know they're responsible enough to have this conversation. So it can be very empowering for them. And there are times where I've moved all the chairs to the side and we've sat on the floor right then and there. That might not be your style, but make it as comfortable as you want it to be. But I would highly encourage you to sit with them and not sit off from the side. I would also encourage you to prepare a seating chart, because it helps you keep track of who speaks. It also makes sure, like, as you're keeping track, you can decide, you know who is participating and who isn't. So whenever you do another discussion, you can give those students little tokens or little things to help them. And it makes sure everyone has a chance to speak. And you can also, it gives you an opportunity to take notes, and you can record ideas that students have said, or things that maybe you want to follow up with later. And it's just a great little tool, and it also helps when you're grading. All right, so going back to the setting up a seating arrangement, I would encourage you to do like a fishbowl arrangement where you have an inner circle and an outer circle, and the inner circle talks for a certain amount of time, and then there's the outer circle, and they switch, so then the outer becomes the inner and the inner becomes the outer. And when and I'll kind of get to this a little bit later, but you can also, with a fishbowl, it's really neat, because if you have a student who is reluctant to speak, you can say, okay, let's take a pause break, turn and talk to your outer partners. And so that you always team up an inside circle person with an outside circle person, and they are kind of like teammates, I guess you could say, or partners. And so if you have that student or students who don't want to speak, then they can turn to their outside partner when it's appropriate, or when you ask them to do that, and they can get ideas from that partner, and maybe that might give them enough encouragement to want to speak in class. You can also use this as a way, whenever you are assessing students, you can have them assess each other, and so the outer circle is listening and assessing the inner circle, and then vice versa. So that's kind of neat too. All right, so what is your role as a teacher? Well, you're the leader. And here are some things that leaders do not do in a shared inquiry. They do not give their side of the story. So they do not impart information. They do not present their own opinions. They also review the guidelines, I'll get to, and you want to share that with the students before you have the discussion. That's really important. I usually share it before every single shared discussion. The first shared inquiry, you will probably spend a little bit more time setting up than the next and the next and the next and the next, but it's really important to go through the steps. Also, you are only going to ask interpretive questions, but you're also going to include some factual and evaluative questions, okay? And then, of course, you can ask follow-up questions. So you really have to plan. All right, so leader roles. Well, like I said before, this can be completely student-led later or eventually, but continued leader roles are shared inquiry leaders must ask but not answer your own questions, help clarify remarks, and your job is also to make sure that everyone is given a chance to offer their opinion. So fishbowl works best for me, but you can experiment. So why fishbowl? Well, I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, but if you really want to know more, like why, ask and I'll be glad to tell you. All right, so shared inquiry leaders help support answers from evidence from the text. So you have to remind, oftentimes I found that I have to remind students, okay, you just said something, or you just posed a question, and now your classmates are answering, but okay, so where did you find that in the text? Can you explain that from the text? Okay, so that's really important. And then lastly, you keep the discussion moving towards a resolution. So that's asking clarifying questions, making sure students are agreeing or disagreeing with ideas, not people, because that's part of how to have a discussion or an argument without being inappropriate or without hurting feelings. So it's really important that you show students how to agree and disagree with ideas, not people. So that's also going back to referring to the text. So how do you select a text? Well, in addition to leading the discussion, you will need to select a text that creates a question, a really burning question, and it can connect like a unit theme, or an idea from the theme that you're currently studying, a current unit that you're in study. But some ideas might be the meaning of justice or the implications of mortality or even morality. Okay, so the relationship of an individual to society. So those are just like more of like language arts, social studies ideas. But there's some definite things like in terms of, like, I know I witnessed in one of the walkthroughs I was doing, they were talking about genetically modified organisms. I mean, there are tons of questions where you could go through that. So that's kind of interesting, like, especially, all right, so anyway, we won't get to that. But a good text for shared inquiry typically presents complex issues, and it's one that students are interested in, they're engaged in, and it evokes questions. Like, you're constantly wanting to ask yourself things when you read it. And then lastly, for language arts, these are some really great texts that get students excited about reading and discussing. So A Good Man is Hard to Find, The Lottery, The Most Dangerous Game, Harrison Bergeron. These texts are controversial when they were published. So that's another clue, is if it ruffles people's feathers, or it might ruffle a feather or two, then that lets you know that it's like really good. All right, so selecting a text. So in order to level a text and make it more accessible, you can use something called rewordify.com. Some other resources are Intervention Central and and when you're on Intervention Central, you can click on Passage Generator and you can copy and paste your text into it, or you can click on Academic Interventions and it makes the text more accessible. Rewordify.com, you basically copy and paste your text into this little box, word box or text box, and it provides like words in their definitions. So that can be helpful for students that struggle. And then obviously I mentioned earlier that you can use Photo Editor app to annotate text. All right, so what are the student roles? Well, students must come prepared for the discussion. If they're not, it's not going to work. And one way that I've helped students come prepared is by providing them with little note cards sometimes of things that they could say, especially if I know that they are reluctant to speak in class. And students should feel free to express their opinion, and even if they're not correct, or if they're unsure of themselves. So make sure that's a very welcoming environment. Students can speak at any time as long as no one else is speaking. So it's really important that you're not calling on students and they know that's not happening, that it's just, as they think of things or saying it, but they still have to be respectful and only one person at a time has the floor. Students may respond to other group members, and the leader can too, in terms of, like, they can respond to the leader, So they can agree, they can disagree, but they need to agree or disagree with ideas, not people. They can add their own thoughts, they can ask questions. So they also need to be able to read and understand the guidelines, and like I said, you'll need to review these each and every time. All right, so both leader and students must read the text at least twice, multiple times, okay, really. Annotate while reading. Number each paragraph so you can quickly refer back to it during the discussion. Prior to the activity, the teacher will prepare the shared inquiry support sheet. I'll share that with you. They'll complete the activity sheet prior to the discussion, so that's students. I use this as a ticket to the discussion, but I always have a backup plan for the students that don't come prepared, because you know your students. And I actually tell the students that the highest grade they can receive if they come to class without the discussion ticket, then the highest grade they can receive is a 70 for it. And I usually, shared inquiries for me are usually like a project grade. Sometimes they're quiz grades, but they're usually a project grade because that's how big they are. So, but you'll need to make necessary modifications and provide students with supports as necessary. I mean, if I know a student struggles, I may make adaptations so that they can complete the task in a manageable time. I might look at the support sheet, and I may adapt it so that they can complete it. This should truly be an enjoyable experience for everyone. We want students to enjoy reading and discussing. Your goal is to get everyone to discuss. So the question you really have to ask yourself is, what kind of supports do I need to put in place for this to happen? And when you do that, great things happen. So in a shared inquiry, there are 3 types of questioning. And there's factual questions, interpretive questions, and evaluative questions. Factual questions are ones that only have one correct answer. I would limit these to like the very beginning of your discussion. You need to focus primarily on interpretive and evaluative. So interpretive questions have more than one answer, okay? Students might offer their opinion there. And then evaluative questions ask us to decide whether we agree with the author's point of view, their purpose. The evaluative question depends on our knowledge, our experience, our connections, our own interpretation of the work. So answers are going to vary with an evaluative question, and that's okay, as long as they can provide evidence from their own life experiences or their own life values. Interpretive questions are going to be grounded in the text. Factual questions are going to be grounded in the text. So just keep that in mind. Factual and interpretive use textual evidence. Evaluative questions, you're using as evidence, you're using your personal life, or students' personal lives, but they are connecting it to the text, okay? So always going back to the text. So an interpretive question should be your main focus, and your question should be discussable, it should be clear, and it should be specific to the text selection. So think you want to evoke a response out of students, okay? And the sequence of questions, it's really up to you. It's all about the ebb and flow and the student input. But it doesn't hurt to plan ahead and create some questions for each of the categories. But, you're a teacher. You've been doing this. Trust your instincts. You'll know when to ask which type of question, and you'll know when to end the discussion. So if the answer is repeated or there's little or no development, it's time to move on to the next question. So this is just a sample sequence. So opening question, factual, maybe like 1 or 2 questions. Core questions, that's your interpretive, 2 or 5, examine central points, interpret a passage, explore a quote or a theme. This can be content specific, okay? And then lastly, you want to end with some sort of closing question, which should be evaluative in nature. That's going to establish, why you're here or what you're, connect it to the real world, connect it to what you're learning, the unit that you're in, and it really truly applies to that person. So it's going to be an individual answer, but they're sharing it with the group. So follow-up questions are not planned ahead of time, and they're asked to individual speakers to probe and clarify. So for example, when a student makes a comment, you might say, or a statement, or ask a question, you say, are you saying X, Y, and Z? Or what do you mean when you say? Tell us more about your thoughts, or tell us more about X, Y, and Z. And this is the one that you're going to use the most. Where in the text did you find support for, and then the whatever they just said, okay? All right, that's it for this.